We're in the midst of a study about the Festival of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Sukkot, as it's known in Hebrew. The seventh festival, which God had listed in Leviticus 23, the appointments of the Lord, the festivals that were the appointments that the people were to keep, they were to come year by year, season by season, to come up to Jerusalem, to keep these ceremonies in the temple of the Lord, or to keep in their synagogues and in their homes. Festivals that were given throughout the generations. Festivals for both the Jews and the non-Jews that would be joined to them. The Festival of Sukkot is the festival that teaches us about the season of our joy, the time of Messiah. He's come, He's arrived, He's here on earth. The festival of the kingdom, the festival of the millennium. It is known as the season of our joy, as we saw in last week's program. It's known as the festival of the ingathering. When the tribulation period is over, and all those that have survived that period, the angels have gone forth, as it said in Matthew chapter 24, that Yeshua would come with the shofar hagadol, the great shofar, the shofar of the Day of Atonement, and that the angels would be sent forth to gather the elect from the four corners of the earth. They're being brought up to Jerusalem. It's called the Festival of the Nations. In last week's program, we looked at Numbers chapter 29, and we saw that God had specified in the additional sacrifices for this festival that on the first day they were to kill 13 bulls, the second day 12, the third day 11, 10, 9, 8, and 7, each day decreasing one bull, and adding all those together, we see that they had to sacrifice 70 bulls. The rabbis asked the question, why 70 bulls? What is God communicating? They found in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, that God had said that He would divide the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. In Exodus 1, it tells us, verse 1, these are the names of the children of Israel. In verse 5, it says that there were 70 sons of Israel who came with Jacob, counting Jacob, into the land of Egypt. So we had 70 nations in the world, 70 children of Israel, and now 70 bullocks. So these bullocks, the bullocks that were being sacrificed, one bullock was seen as being for each of the nations. So Sukkot began to be called by the Jewish people the Festival of the Nations. Last week we also looked at Zechariah chapter 14, which tells us about in that day that the Lord will go forth and fight for Jerusalem, and in that day His foot will touch the Mount of Olives, He'll stand on the mountain will split in half, and He's coming from the east into the city, coming to the eastern gate, and He is establishing the kingdom here on earth. Water will go out from underneath the threshold, from the Aron Kodesh, from the ark of the Lord, will go out, and it will go to all the nations for the healing of the nations. We're told in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 22, that from one new moon to another new moon, from one Sabbath to another Sabbath, that all flesh will come to worship before the Lord. In the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48, it tells us that all the nations will come and keep, during the millennium, the festival of Sukkot. So let's go to the board and start to bring in some new information for today. The Feast of Sukkot, let's write this down, is going to be the season of our joy. Season of our joy. And of course, it's called Sukkot, which means the booths or tabernacles. And then number 3, it is the festival of ingathering. And this is when the second tithe will be paid, and we will be talking about this in the next few weeks, if this is something that interests you, the subject of tithing. The ingathering of the harvest, which relates directly to the ingathering of the believers, and it is called the Festival of the Nations. New title. This is one we're going to look at today. It is called the Festival of Dedication. The Festival of Dedication. Remember that the season of Sukkot, or the festival of Sukkot, starts on Tishrei 15, and it goes to the 21st. Tishrei is about our September, October, and so it goes from the middle of the month to the 21st, 7 days. 7 days, but then we have a day that is tacked on to it. If you'll look in Leviticus chapter 23, we're told, speak to the children of Israel, verse 34, saying, the 15th day of the seventh month shall be a feast of tabernacles for 7 days to the Lord. Then looking at verse 39, also on the 15th day of the seventh month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the festival of the Lord for 7 days. On the first day there shall be a Shabbaton, a Sabbath, a high Sabbath, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. Now last week we presented that there is a day that is attached to Sukkot called Shemini Atzeret, which literally translates as the 8th conclusion. But this day was called by the people the 8th day. The 8th day, we'll just put 8 days. The 8th day. And then we have, if you'll turn please to chapter 29 of Numbers, we're going to see it referred to by this title again, Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day. And 29, you're told, verse 12, on the 15th day of the 7th month you shall have a holy convocation. And then as you go, it tells you in verse 35, on the 8th day you shall have a sacred assembly, you shall do no customary work. Now, Shemini Atzeret is not Sukkot. It is attached to Sukkot. So the people are going to think of it as both being 7 days and 8 days. 7 days and 8 days. Now, I'd like for you, please, to turn in your Bibles to the book of Chronicles. Well, let's do it out of Kings. We'll go to 1 Kings. And in 1 Kings, we're going to see that Solomon, is going to build the temple. Now, Solomon, in Hebrew, we call him Shlomo, means peace. He is the Prince of Peace. He is a picture of Messiah. He is a picture of the Messiah that's coming, and he's filled with what we call the Chachmah, which means the wisdom of God. The reason that he's filled with this is because God wanted to show us something about Yeshua. He wanted to show us something about the Prince of Peace that was coming, and that his wisdom would be so great. He is the builder of the temple, just as Messiah will be the builder of the temples. Both spiritually, he spiritually built the temple of the believers, and then physically, it is promised that there is another temple that is coming. And Messiah will be the one at the end of the tribulation, after the tribulation temple has been desecrated, will rededicate it back to God, expand it, and it will be called the Prince of Peace's temple, the Messiah's temple. Notice also that as we talk about Solomon, that this man, his attire, his clothing was so great that the court, the majesty of his court was so beautiful that even the servants of Solomon, their dress, their attire, and the way that they handled themselves became just a marvel to the world. And people would come from all over the world, not only to see Solomon, but to see his servants. What was God doing? He was giving you a picture of the way that you will be in the Messianic kingdom, the way that you will be when Messiah has come, and he will be the greatest of all, but you will have a new body. You'll have a glorified body, and you will be a marvel to all the world. They will come to see you even as they have come to see the Messiah. Now, in chapter 5, 6, and so forth, we have Solomon's building the temple. Shlomo is building the temple, and it is a majestic building. In chapter 8, the temple was built. And we're told, verse 1, Now Shlomo assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to King Shlomo in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled to King Shlomo at the festival in the month of Etanim, which is the 7th month. Now, Etanim is the same thing as Tishrei. It is just another name for Tishrei, Etanim. Then all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. Now, the temple's been built. Let's drop down to verse 22. Then Shlomo stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel and spread out his hands toward heaven. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven above or on earth below like you, who keep your covenant and mercy with your servants, who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept what you have promised your servant David my father. You have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day. Therefore, Lord God of Israel, now keep what you promised your servant David my father, saying, You shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel, only if your sons take heed to their way, that they walk before me as you have walked before me. And now I pray, O God of Israel, let your word come true, which you have spoken to your servant David my father. Verse 27, But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this temple which I have built. And so please look at this where it says, But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Verse 27. What Shlomo is doing is dedicating the temple. This is his dedication speech, his prayer before God. And he is going to give eternal things, that if the people, wherever they would be dispersed, if they would turn and remember Jerusalem, remember that God has placed his name here, and if they would face this city and pray and call upon the name of the Lord, that God would hear their prayer, whether they are a stranger or whether they are a Jew in the land, outside the land. God has forever set apart Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah, one of the mountains within the city of Jerusalem, as the site of his temple. Now, Mount Moriah sits high up. There are 3 mountains in the city of Jerusalem. One, the western mountain, is called Mount Zion. The middle mountain is going to be called Mount Moriah, and the eastern mountain will be called the Mount of Olives. 3 mountains, and the way that these mountains are constructed is unique. And later on, we're going to show how that there is a Hebrew letter written in the valleys between these mountains that is a letter that stands for the name of God. That letter is the Shin, which is the first letter of the Hebrew word Shaddai, which means the Almighty God. God literally, on the geography of the earth, placed his name so that you couldn't see it in the days of Yeshua, but by airplane and by satellite today, as we look down, there is a giant Hebrew letter stamped right on the face of the earth. Now that location, Mount Moriah, is the place of the temple. Verse 62. Then the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before the Lord, and Shlomo offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to the Lord 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. So it is called the Festival of Dedication. On the same day, the king consecrated the middle of the court that was in front of the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings, grain offerings, the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar that was before the Lord was too small to receive the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the fat of the peace offerings. At that time, Shlomo held a festival, and all Israel with him, a great congregation from the entrance of Hamat to the brook of Egypt, before the Lord our God, 7 days, and 7 more days, 14 days. So let's write this down. 14 days. 14 days. They're going to be dedicating the temple. And it tells us in verse 66, on the 8th day, he sent the people away. Now, it could not be the 8th day of the 14 days, because they would have gone home before they finished dedicating. When it says the 8th day, it is talking about the Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day the 8th day that you have at the conclusion to the festival. That is the day he sends them home. So if I subtract from the 22nd of Tishrei, this would be the day called the 8th day. If I go backwards for 8 days, if I go backwards for 14 days, it will lead me to the 8th of Tishrei. This is the day that they began dedicating the temple. In other words, 2 days before the Day of Atonement, and they went all the way to the 22nd of Tishrei. Now, what we need to do is see something about how this dedication was done and the various customs of it. Because all of this is going to relate to the birth of the Messiah, Yeshua. Here we have the temple. And I'm going to draw this after the fashion of the temple during the days of Yeshua. And this would be the western side. The western side, so this is the eastern side. This would be the north, and this is the south. On the western side, we have the building. This is called the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. And it's divided into 2 rooms. You have the Holy of Holies and the Holy Place. This is a courtyard. Right here is the altar. And then you have a laver over here. They kill the animals right in here. There's several buildings along the sides here. This is the court of Israel. Let's write Israel here. The court of Israel. This is the court of the priest. And we're going to have 4 rooms. 4 rooms. This is called the court of the women. The court of the women. And there is a gate here going in called the gate of Nicanor. This is where the Levitical choir would stand. Now, around all of this is another courtyard, very huge courtyard, called the court of the Gentiles. And of course, you always come in from the east, heading on in. You're always climbing higher and higher and higher. Now, in the court of the women cannot go past this place. In fact, the Gentiles cannot go into the court of the women. The women cannot go into the court of Israel. That's just for the men. And then the men cannot go into the court of the priest. You have to be from the tribe of Levi to go into there. And to go into this building, the holy place and the Holy of Holies, you have to be a priest. You can't just be from the tribe of Levi. To go into the Holy of Holies, you have to be the high priest. In the court of the women, they place 4 posts. So let's draw 4 X's here. These posts are huge. Now remember that Mount Moriah sits on top of a mountain, and they have built it up. Each time you go into a court, you're climbing. You're going higher and higher and higher. This is called making aliyah, to go up. And you are going up towards this room. This is the throne room of the Almighty God. This is the place that He is seen to operate from. You always, coming into the temple, you face towards this room. You never turn your back on God's throne. If you leave the temple, there is a one-way gate here and a one-way gate here. You have to go in this way, and then you back out. You can't turn your back around because you never show that disrespect to an earthly king, much less to the King of Kings. Now we have these 4 great posts. On each of the posts, we're going to have, let's write this down, 4 posts. And on each of the posts, we're going to have 4 vats of oil. 4 vats of oil. Now, each vat is huge. They each hold 11 logs of oil. A log is larger than a gallon. It's gigantic vats of oil. It's so big that a separate priest will be assigned to each of the vats. So we have 4 vats on 4 posts, so a total of 16 vats. 16 vats of oil, and these are hung up in the air. So you have a large post and then a vat of oil. Inside the vat, you're going to have the used undergarments of the priest. These are called swaddling cloths. swaddling cloths you have put down into these vats of oil, and these will be lit. Now the reason for this is that the temple during the festival of Sukkot is going to be called, and you'll love this, it's going to be called the light of the world. The light of the world. And let's write that down over here. The light of the world. And the festival was called the Festival of Lights. Please remember, and each week as you come back, bring your notes from the last week, because there's no way that we can go through these festivals in 30 minutes. We have to build it and build it and build it, but we build on the information that you have in one week. Next week it will be used in the week following. So here it's called the Festival of Lights because in the courtyard of the women, the 4 great lights with 4 vats or 4 posts with 4 lights on each one of them. It was said that this light was so bright, and this is a tradition, I doubt that this is true, it's like an exaggeration, but it was said that it was not necessary during the festival of Sukkot that anyone have a light at their house, because the light from the temple was so great that it totally took away every shadow, every darkness outside of the city or within the city. So, we're going to go to the book of Luke, and we're going to begin a study that should take us about 3 weeks concerning the birth of the Messiah Yeshua. In Luke chapter 1, in Luke 1, we'll start in verse 5. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. Please write that down, the division of Abijah. Let me put this on the board for you. And we'll erase this for right now. We'll probably use the temple drawing at another time, so keep it handy. It's very good to be able to see how things develop. But we're told that he is a priest named Zechariah, and he's of the division of Abijah. And then you're told his wife was the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elisheva. Write that down. Elisheva, which means God remembers, and Zechariah means his oath. Now, for 400 years, there has been no message from God in the sense of a prophet, in the sense of there being God manifesting himself. And of course he had come and been among the people at times. He had fought in the various wars, so forth. But God had not sent a prophet to them. It's called the 400 silent years. It's called that in Orthodox Judaism. It's called that in conservative Christianity. So with Zechariah, all of a sudden, that's going to change. Because Zechariah, we are told, it says they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. But they had no child because Elisheva was barren, and they were both well advanced in years. So it was that while he was serving as priest before God in the order of his division. Hold your hand here in Luke chapter 1 and turn back to 1 Chronicles and chapter 24. 1 Chronicles chapter 24. And what we'll be looking at is how David divided the priest. He divided them into divisions, or what is known as courses. And they were divided into 24 divisions, 24 courses. And if you were in the first division, you would serve the first week of the Jewish year, the week of Aviv. You would serve in the temple. At the end of the week, you'd go back home. You wouldn't come back till your course came up again. If you were in the second course, you would serve the second week. However, it gets complicated when we come to the third week of the year, because that's a festival. And all the courses are required to come up. Therefore, the third course, the third division, will serve their division time actually the fourth week of the year. Now, we have been told that Zechariah is of the division of Abiyah. So we see in verse 10, it says the 7th to Hakkoz, the 8th to Abiyah. So now we can figure out, when was Zechariah ministering in the temple? Well, it's very simple. It was in the 10th week of the year. We had to add a week for unleavened bread, and we had to add a week for Shavuot, or Pentecost. And it's in the 10th week, he is ministering, and we're told that he's burning incense. In the temple, in one of the rooms, you have the HaKodesh. You have an altar of incense, a golden altar, and they would stand there and they have 18 prayers. What are those prayers? These prayers are prayed the same week after week, actually day after day after day. And the prayers will pray that God would send Elijah the prophet, because when Elijah comes, Messiah comes. And the Messiah is the prayer of the people. Next week, in the footsteps of the Messiah.